Hey, and welcome back to another video. And in today's video, what we're going to be doing is we're going to basically be building on top of our previous two videos. But this time, instead of us, working on our form in UI kit, we're actually going to work on our form in Swift UI. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically build this dynamic form, as you can see on the screen here. And we're also going to add in some validation. So if I just type in the email field, you can see how as I type, it basically tells me when the email field is valid. So let's jump straight into the video and let's see how we can do this in Swift UI. All right, cool. So the first one that we're going to build is basically build our component. So there's three views that we basically need to build. So the first view is a text field view, a date view, and we also need to build a button view. So what we're going to do, we're just going to basically create a new folder here. And I'm just going to call this views. And then within this folder, we're going to basically build our first view. So we're going to call this one our text field form view. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So what we basically have here is we basically have a VStack and we basically set the alignment for the whole component to be leading. So everything goes to the left-hand side. We basically have a text field here and just some placeholder text, which we'll deal with later, as well as the constant binding. So this is just like a binding with a default value, which we'll be working with later. I basically set the frame to be infinity, so it fills its whole container with a minimum width with a minimum height of 44. And also as well, I've added some padding inside of the text field. So basically it adds padding to the left-hand side of 5, and you'll see why I do that in a second. And we basically set a keyboard type here to default, which again we'll be working with later. And the reason why I set the padding on the left-hand side to 5 is because of this here. Now, with text fields, you actually can give them their own like style, like a corner radius style. Or if you do that, you can actually change the border around the text field, which is something that I want to do, which is why instead of using the style, I basically add a background with a rounded rectangle and basically set a stroke on the rounded rectangle myself so I can control the colors that you see. And then below that, we basically have a text here, which we're going to basically use for our error when we get onto that as well. So this is a very, simple layout. It's nothing too crazy. And now what we need to do is I just like to do this, it's a habit. So I'm just going to basically turn this into like what the component would look like. So on the preview, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add some padding so I can just basically make sure that it's not to the left and right. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to basically preview this as its component. So actually, let me just switch these two around. And then rather than doing horizontal, yeah, cool. So now I can see what this component looks like. So now the next thing we need to do is we need to actually build our date form view. So we just go into your views folder and then just basically create a new Swift UI file again. And then, all right, cool. So let's just look what we've got here. So we basically got a date picker, and we basically set the selection for the date to just basically be just bound to a constant of date object, which again we'll deal with later. We basically specify that we only want to use the date component from the date picker, and this property here is pretty important. So by default with date pickers, you basically get this label that you can display on the left hand side for free. But if you don't add this modifier, it basically adds like space to the left hand side. If I just turn this off now, you should see how it adds that space to the left hand side. So to remove that space, we basically want to say that we want to hide this label. And then what we basically say here is we want the component to fill the whole screen like our text form component. And we also want to basically set the leading of it to be, sorry, we want to set the alignment of it to be leading. So you can see as well below that we actually do have our text object here. I'm just going to change this to error here so it's clearer. So this is where our error label will be. And again, similarly, we basically apply the same styles for our error label. Now, there's a bit of duplication here between these two. So what we could do is we could move that into its own modifier, like a custom modifier. But for the sake of this video, I'm not going to do it. So that's some homework for you. So what I'm going to do again is I'm basically going to again just basically use the same modifiers from here to basically Preview this. All right, cool. And we basically have one more component that we need to build. So we basically need to build our button form view. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So as you can see, we basically got our button here with, again, similarly again in terms of the frame, the styles, just setting some colors and configurations. And again, I'm just gonna basically copy this so we can just preview this. Right, cool. So now we have our components all built. All right, sweet. So that's what we need to do. We need to actually break down, how this is going to work with our model. Now, I actually have a video that I used in my previous video, which I'm going to replay here to get that message across. So if you've already watched this, then you can basically skip by this. But if you haven't, then you probably do want to watch this so we can talk about the design of our model. So let's jump into that graphic now. So before we actually start and actually build our dynamic form, I actually want to basically break down how we're actually going to tackle building the models for our form that's going to be basically built off. So essentially, what we're going to do is we're basically going to use a class. We're basically going to have a form component class that we use, which is going to basically be our base class for all our components. So you may be wondering, why am I using a class and not a protocol or a struct? So essentially, the reason why we're doing this is because when we're working with different data sources, when we're passing in our type within our generic, we're not actually able to apply generic constraint on protocols, or we're not able to actually subclass structs with other structs. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically have a base class called form component, and this is going to basically be our base class that allows us to basically mix and match the different types of components based on inheritance. So if you just look at the components on the screen of what we're going to be working with, so essentially what we have is we have a first name, last name, and an email. And what this is going to be is it's basically going to be one component called a text component. So our text component is actually going to subclass our form component. What we're also going to do is we're going to basically build a date component. And again, the date component is going to subclass our form component as well. And then on top of that, again, we're also going to basically build a button component for our button as well. Now, as you can see, what we're basically doing here is inheritance. So if we want to add a brand new component, let's say for example a picker component, we just have to basically build the model for this and then basically subclass our form component class. So now by doing this, we can basically have a dynamic array of components that all have a similar implementation and basically use this to basically build up our form dynamically, which is what we're going to go through next. All right, cool. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to jump into code and actually start building out this model that we've explained and see how we can do this in Swift. Cool. So what we're going to do now is we're basically going to build our model for our form. So the first thing we're going to do, is I'm actually going to create a folder here, new group. I'm just going to call this form. And I'm going to put these views inside the form just so we can organize this a bit better. And then inside the form, we're going to create a new folder called model. And then create a new file called Swift file. All right, cool. So let's break this down. So essentially what we have here is our base implementation that we're going to use via a protocol for our form component, which we'll move on to in a bit. So each form component should have a unique identifier using the UUIDs. We also have this called a form ID. So why do we have a form ID and an ID? So the reason why we have a form ID is if we basically want to emit an event to basically say what form field was an action performed on, which is why we have an enum to basically do that. And we'll break the enum down in a second. And we also basically have our value here as well, which is also a optional any. So the reason why we made it optional is because we may not want some form components to even have a value, so they can just be nil. So for example, the button can be nil. And the reason why we made it any, so we can basically accept any type of value, and that's of type. This is basically a getter as well. So what we're going to do is break down this enum, and this form field enum that we basically have here is basically has all these different cases. So we have first name, last name, email, date of birth, and submit. And the reason why we basically do use this enum is because, like I said before, we basically want to use enums to basically drive and basically tell us when something has happened. So We'll move on to it in a bit, but let's say, for example, if someone taps a button, we may want to find out which form field someone specifically tapped. All right, cool. So the next thing we need to do is we essentially need to now basically the next thing we need to do now is we basically need to build our actual form component. So let's do that now. So now we basically have our base form component here. So this is a form component that our other components will subclass. And this uses the protocol to basically get the implementation that we defined before. But now what we also have is we also have identifiable on our class. So the reason why it has identifiable is because when you're working with lists in SwiftUI, it basically needs to be able to uniquely identify which item is basically going through in a list. So that's why we basically have our ID that we define here as well. So we basically insert and inject a form field from our enum to basically say what the form field type should be for this component. And like I said before, value is optional. So by default, it'll be nil. And if we want to set it later, which we will be doing, we can easily do that. So what we need to do now is we basically need to build our components. So we need to basically build our button, text, and date component. And what we're going to do is I'm going to type them out and then break them down one by one. So let's just start here. So we basically have our text form component. If we look, we're basically actually using some UI kit. So we just scroll to the top. We have to import UI kit in order to use some of these properties. So when you're building your models, you basically want your models to basically act as the object that allows you to pass in configuration. So you can basically build like a dynamic, form and views or whatever it is that you're building. So in our case, with our text form component, we want it to basically hold the placeholder for the text field, and we want it to hold the keyboard type that we define as well. So in our initializer, you can see how we initialize it with a form field, so we can give our text form component the form field, the ID that we want. So for example, with this text form component, the IDs that this will have is first name, last name, and email. And then we basically have our placeholder for the text field that we want to use. And we also have the keyboard type. So we may want to have a different keyboard type. So for example, on our first name and last name, we'll use the default keyboard. But on our email, we'll specify that we want to use the email keyboard. And then all we do is we basically use the super init from our subclass to initialize and set the ID for our component. So we just scroll down a bit. On our date component, we have a similar kind of setup again, where we basically define the mode that we want to use for the date picker. So we could say specifically which date picker mode we want, so we can highly customize this. And then again, we just basically pass in the ID that we want for this. So in this case, the ID for this component is going to be date of birth. And then we just use subclassing again to initialize it. And then finally, on our button form component, we basically this time pass in the title for the button that we want. So if we want to have it say save or submit or done or whatever it is that we want. And then similarly again, you can see here how we have the ID. So in this case, this one's going to basically be submit. And then again, we just use subclassing to initialize it and set an ID. Awesome. So what we need to do now is we actually need to move on and actually put this together into a dynamic array of form components so we can basically build our actual content off this array. So let's do that now. So if you just basically go into the form folder here and create a new group called builder. And then let's create a new Swift file called form content builder. So before I break this down, I actually want to discuss something. So you may be wondering, why am I using this keyword, or what does this even mean? So essentially, final means that you don't want the class to be able to be subclass. So we actually just quickly go back to our model. You can see how I don't actually want to allow anyone to basically subclass any of these components. I want this to be the final declaration for them. So it's the same with our content builder. I don't want anyone to be able to subclass this class, which is why we mark it as, final. And we basically declare the implementation that we want for our content builder. So as you can see, we basically got a protocol here, and we basically define the content, which will be an array of form components. And then we basically have our class here called form content builder impl, so for implementation. And then we basically use the protocol to conform to that within our class. And if you just look at our content here, we have an array of components. So as you can see, we have our text components, and we have our date form components, and we have our button component. And as you can see, like I specified before, we basically now have it where we basically, say this is the configuration that we want for each one of these components. As you can see with the IDs and the placeholders and the keyboard type. So we're defining how we want to configure our views in this class here. And we're able to mix and match the different types of components because we're allowing our form components to subclass form component. And you'll see how doing this technique is really, really, in my opinion, really, really good. And it basically allows you to basically make your views and anything that you're building a lot more dynamic and easy to interchange and build on top of and scalable. So when you're working with state objects, essentially what that's going to allow us to do is to observe an object and basically see the changes that happen so we can basically react and do some sort of configurations in Swift UI. So before we actually use our state object, what we need to do is we actually need to mark our class as an observable object. So what we're going to do is we're going to import combine, and then before the implementation, we're just going to type observable object. And now our class is an observable object, so we can actually observe changes that happen to this class. So now if we go into our content view, above the body, let's just type this out. What we need to do is essentially, you can see here, we declare the state object. Now you may be wondering, why am I using state object and I'm not using something like observed object? Well, the reason why is because this has been available since iOS 14, I want to say, and this basically ensures that our class doesn't get disposed of whenever the state changes. So for example, if you change between different windows and whatnot, it will maintain the same state. So this is a lot safer than using observed object. And what we basically want to do here now that we have our content builder is we basically want to loop through all the views that we have in our array and dynamically show a component. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So before we actually start off with that, let's just basically get the skeleton in place. So I'm using a lazy V grid here rather than a list. And why am I using that? And why am I using that? So essentially, the reason why I'm using a lazy V grid rather than a list is because with lists, you basically get that annoying separated inset stuff. And I don't want to have to handle any of that. So with a lazy V grid, you basically don't get any separated insets, and it's a lot more flexible in terms of making views, self-sizing. So what we're basically going to do is we basically specified that we've got a scroll view. So you need to use a scroll view if you want to use a lazy grid. And inside of our scroll view, we basically put a V grid, and they both have some padding. So on our scroll view, we have some padding on the horizontal. So I can actually see it. So, oh yeah, I did already. Yeah, so we have our padding horizontally. And then on our V grid, we basically have some padding on the top. So we can basically push down any content within it. And we basically specified columns here. So in these columns, we basically said that we want to have a flexible item within this grid, which has a minimum. So the minimum size that this can be is 44. And we also want to have 20 space in between each item. So what we need to do now is we need to actually loop through our content in our content builder and use a switch statement to dynamically say which component to show on the screen. So let's do that now. So as you can see, we're looping through our content using for each, and the reason why we're able to do that is because, like, if we go into we go into our text component, form component is of type identifiable, so that's what allows us to use the for each. So we're basically looping through each component, and we're using a switch statement to basically check what each component is. So if it's a text form component that we're currently on, then we go for the text field, as you can see here. If it's a date form component, we go for the date form component. If it's a button form component, we go for the button form view. And if it can't match any of these, then we're just going to result to just showing an empty view, so nothing. All right, cool. So the next thing that we need to do is we actually need to actually pass in our configuration that we specified within our component into each view, so inject into each view. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically do that with our text field form view now, where we pass this component in. So let's go into our text field form view. And then in our struct, let's basically define a new constant. So this is our component. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to basically get an error down here, which is fine. So in our previews, let's just fix that. And then we'll just basically create an initializer with an ID. So it doesn't really matter what you put in here, you just need to fill it out. Cool. And then what we want to do now is we actually want to use the configuration from our model in here. So where it says placeholder here, let's replace that with our placeholder from our component. And also as well, where it says keyboard type, let's replace that. Cool. So now what we need to do is go back into our content view and we should get an error saying that we're missing the parameter, which is fine. And then all we need to do is basically force cast our component as a text form component. And this isn't going to fail because we're safely checking to see if it is this type here. So let's do that now. Cool. And we need to do the same for our date form view and button form view. So let's do that now. And again, we should get an error down here. Fine. We'll just basically say DOB, and then the mode here will say date. So I just realized, so in our date form component, let's actually just go back. And rather than this being UI date picker mode, we're going to change the type of this to be date components. And here we're going to change this again also to date picker components. And this should complain. Fine. So at the top here, we're going to import Swift UI. Cool. Now our model should be fine. But what we need to do now, so now if we go back here, we need to basically use our component here. Mode. All right, cool. All right, cool. So now what we need to do is we need to inject that component into this view. So let's go here and then let's fix this. And then we're going to say component as date form component. Build, resume. Cool. So you can see here it's looking fine. And then finally, we need to do it with our button form view. So let's do that now. Look at an error down here. And then what we need to do in our button form view here is we actually need to use the title from our component here. So let's do that now. Sweet. And then finally, what we need to do is we need to, again, update this. So now, if I just basically just pin this here, if we just go into our model or our form content builder, you can see here that the configuration looks the same. So we're actually building this now based off this array. So this is dynamic. So if we want to add a new component here like this, then we easily can. So we can easily just build on top of this using or by changing and updating this array. All right, cool. So the next thing that we need to do is we basically need to handle our validation with our labels and whatnot. So in order to do that, we're going to basically use something called regular expressions. So regular expressions are basically patterns that you can basically match a string against. So if a string matches the pattern, then it's valid, and if it doesn't, then it doesn't. Then it's wrong, I should say. So in our case, if it matches the string, then that means that our validation is valid. And if it doesn't, then we need to show that there's an error. And we need to also show what the actual error is. So what we're going to do is if you just go into your form folder here and just right click. And then let's create a new group in here called regex. And then we're going to create a new folder in here called patterns. And then a new file in patterns called regex patterns. So for our regular expression patterns, I'm just going to basically be using the patterns from a previous video. So I'll leave the link to this in the description box below. But I'm just going to copy this. And then I'm just going to basically just replace the whole contents of this file with that. So these are our regular expression patterns. So we're going to be checking for if the email has a @ character in it, if it's higher than 6 characters, 6 characters or more, and also as well if the name is a valid name, so it doesn't have like any spaces after the name and whatnot. So next what we need to do is we actually need to build our validators. But before we do that, I want to actually discuss how we're going to actually tackle building our validators with a graphic. So let's just watch that now. So if you actually go and look at our form model in the form folder, you'll basically see that we have a group of components. Now, because we actually want to do some validation, what we actually want to do is we want to basically assign each one of our components their own specific validator. Now, in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're basically going to use something called a protocol. I want each validator to basically have the same interface or implementation, but I basically want the logic or the business logic within that validator to basically work differently between each one. So by this basically will allow us to basically mix and match. So let's just break down the validators that we're actually going to use within our app. So the first validator we're going to have essentially is we're going to have something called a regular expression validator. And I'll go into a bit more detail in the next chapter about what regular expressions are. But basically, this validator is going to basically be of type validator protocol, and it's going to allow us to basically run regular expressions. So we're mainly going to use this on our text components. So we're also going to have another type of validator called a date validator, which again will be of type validator protocol. And this is mainly what we're going to use on our date of birth component, so our date component. Now, you'll also realize as well that we actually have a button. Now, obviously on the button, we actually do not need a validator at all. So what we're going to do, we're not actually going to give our button component a validator object at all. So by us using this protocol, and you'll see how we'll use it in a bit in the next sections, it basically allows us to basically mix and match and dynamically create an array of objects which are of type validator protocol. And we can basically implement the same interface or implementation for each validator, but the business logic will be different between them. All right, cool. So now that we've broken down how we're going to tackle this, let's create a brand new folder in regex. I'm just going to basically call this model. So this is going to be our model for our regular expressions. And then we're going to create a new file. Cool. So this is basically a lightweight struct that essentially just basically holds our pattern. So what we need to do is, because we've defined the pattern that we want for our regex form item, we now also need to define an error with this form item if this pattern fails. So in the regex folder, let's create a new group called error. And then we'll create a new file called validation error. This file, we're basically going to have an enum that we'll basically use for basically emitting errors and also getting an error description. So let's just type it out and break it down. Okay, cool. So what we basically have here is we basically have an enum called validation error, and it basically has its one case, but it also conforms to error. So this basically allows us to treat this as an error when we want to basically use this later. Also as well, you can see here that we have our case custom and it has an associated value called message. So we do this so that we can easily get the message from this enum case if we need to, by basically accessing it via this computer property called error description. So what we need to do is we actually need to associate our custom error with the pattern. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go back into here, and where it says underneath pattern, we're just going to say like so. So now whenever we define a pattern, we're also going to define the validation error that should show whenever that pattern fails. All right, cool. So now what we need to do is basically need to build our like validation manager or view model to basically validate our different types of validators. So inside of regular expression, let's create a new group and we'll just call this manager. And then within this file, we'll basically create a new file called validation manager. And then because we want to basically have different types of validation managers, we're going to use a protocol so they basically all have a base implementation. And then we can define the business logic that actually happens within each validator. So let's just type this out now. Right. Cool. So we basically have our protocol validation manager and we have our function validate, which accepts a value of any. And we basically have this underscore here. Now, if you've never saw this before, it basically means that we're just omitting the parameter. So you don't really see a parameter before when you use this function. So we just basically just put a value straight into it without the need of a parameter. And we basically return a optional validation error. So why do we do this? So the reason why we do this is because when we're working with our SwiftUI view, we basically want to essentially react to whether if something is either true or false. So views, when you're basically reacting to them, evaluate some kind of like expression. So within a modifier, we want to basically check to see if this is either nil or not nil, and depending on the outcome of this state, we're basically going to, change our views. So that's why we mark this as optional. So what we need to do is we essentially need to now define the implementation for our regex one. So let's do that now. Okay, cool. So as you can see here, we basically have a struct. And why am I using a struct and not a class? Well, essentially the reason why is because the whole purpose of this validation manager isn't to be kept in memory and to be referenced so we can change and update some sort of value. The only responsibility of this validation manager is to tell us whether something is right or wrong. So it's safe and it's okay to actually use a struct to essentially create these lightweight copies of this object because we don't need loads of them in memory. So what we're going to do is we're basically going to conform this struct, so our regex validation manager implementation, to the validation manager. And as you can see, what we're basically doing here is we're basically saying that we want to have an array of regex form items. So we're going to inject an array of regular expressions into this validation manager. And within our validate function that we declared in our protocol, we're going to basically cast the type as a string, and we're going to basically loop through all the regular expressions. But we're going to use this class that's provided from, Apple in the frameworks called NS regular expression, which allows us to basically define a pattern for our regular expression. So we're going to basically get the pattern out of our item, so our regular expression form item, and then we're going to basically say that we want to evaluate the range. So the range basically means like the length of the string. So in this case, we want to start from the beginning, which is 0, all the way to the end, which is the count. And then what we're going to do is we're basically going to look to see if we can find a match in that string of value, as you can see here in the range. So if this returns nil, so if it doesn't find a match, then we're going to basically throw the error from our regular expression form item that we declared before. Or if it does find a match, then it's just going to carry on, carry on, carry on. And if it doesn't, it just finds matches for every single form item, then we're just going to return nil. So in our case, nil basically means that everything was okay. So we've got one more validate that we need to write out, and we need to write this out called the date validator. So let's do that now. Okay, cool. So before we get started on the date validator, notice how, because we're using protocols, we can basically essentially just define different types of business logic, as you can see here. So because we're using protocols, we don't have to have one big, class or function that does many different things. We can just easily just like create small and composable objects that we can inject into different places. So in this case here, we basically have our private constant called age limit. And what we're going to basically do is we're going to check the value that gets casted as a date. So if this fails, then we're going to basically return a validation error that an invalid value was passed. So if that fails, and what we're going to do is we're going to use the calendar date components to basically see if the difference from today to the date that we passed into this function is less than 18. And if it is less than 18, then what we're going to do is we're going to return a custom error saying that the user is below the age of 18. And if it isn't under 18, so they're over 18, then we're just going to return nil, so everything's okay. So what we need to do now is we actually need to see how we can actually use these validators in our content builder. So let's do that now. So in order to do that, we need to make a small change to our model. So if you just go into your model folder in the form here, What we need to do is if you just scroll up in our form item, what we want to do now is we now want to define our validations. So underneath the form ID, let's just basically say var. So essentially what we're saying here is we basically want all our form item to basically have an array of validation managers. So it's worth noting that not every single component needs a validation. So for example, a button doesn't need one. So that's why we basically defined it as an array so we can pass in multiple ones. And also as well, what we'll be able to do is define whether you even need to pass in a array of validation managers. So we should get an error on our form component saying that we're missing this validation. So let's add this in now. So what we need to do now is we essentially now need to basically update our initializer so we can basically pass in validation managers if we want to. Okay, cool. So now what we need to do is we need to actually update our text form component and our date form component to essentially allow a user to basically pass in their validators when you're building this. So after we define our keyboard type, let's just basically declare a new property called validations, which will be of type validation manager. And we'll basically give it a default value of an empty array. And then we'll basically initialize our validations with validations. All right, cool. So let's just break this down. So essentially, we've now got a new property in our text form component called validations, which again is an array of validation managers. But why did I give it a default value of an empty array? Well, not every single text field that you will work with in a form needs to be validated. So you may just want to have a text field that's optional. So by doing this, you can basically essentially just bypass the validations on certain text form components. So as you can see, we pass it in to via our initializer so we can initialize our object with its validations. So now let's apply the exact same concept to our date form component. Okay, cool. And as you can see, same again, we have our new property for our validations, and we also have the validations as well. And again, we have a default array here just in case we don't actually want to validate the data and make this optional. And what we're going to do, we're going to actually leave our button form component because we don't need to initialize it with any validations because it's a button. And you can see how it's not complaining, and that's because in our form component, we've already declared that we want this to be an empty array of validation managers. All right, cool. So now what we need to do is we actually need to see how we can actually use these validations within our form content builder. So let's go into our form content builder. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to update these and then go through each one with their validations. Okay, cool. So let's just basically break this down. So as you can see in our text form component, we're now using the validations property. And as you can see, it takes an array of validations. So what we're going to basically say in here is we want to basically use our regex validation implementation. And this is going to basically hold an array of regex form item. So we're only passing in one regular expression form item within this array, as you can see here. And we basically define in our form item the pattern. So the pattern here is going to be name, and the error, if this name is invalid, is going to say invalid first name entered. So we do the exact same thing for our last name, as you can see here, with a custom message. But if you actually scroll down and look at our email, it's a bit different. So in our email, we have the exact same implementation with our regular expression validation manager, except this time you can see how we're actually able to pass in two different form items that we're going to validate against. So the first one it's going to validate is the email characters. So if this is invalid, it will show this message. And then what we're going to do is we're going to validate if it's higher than 6 characters. So if it's less than 6 characters, then we're going to basically show this validation error message here. And then on our date form component, you can see in our validations that we're passing in a completely different date validation manager. So you can see how we're able to mix and match these because of our protocol. And finally, on our button form component, we don't have any changes because we don't want to apply any validation on here at all. So the next thing that we need to do is we actually need to use these validators within our component. So we want our component to basically validate itself and tell us an output to the screen, whether something's gone wrong or if everything's okay. So the first one we're going to tackle is our text form component. So let's go into our text form component. All right, cool. So essentially what we want to do is when someone's actually typing in this text field, what we want to do is want to basically observe whether there's been an error, and we also want to observe what the person has typed in this text field. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically create two state variables that allow us to basically listen to the text and listen to whenever a validation error has occurred. So let's just type this out now. Right, okay, sweet. So essentially, as you can see here, we've got two new state variables. So why are we using a state? Well, when you're working with SwiftUI, you want to basically use a state if you need to listen to and observe a change and bind it to other, objects and whatnot. So what we want to do is we want to basically have our text here, which is going to be an empty string, and we want to basically bind this text to our text field so we can basically observe whenever someone's actually typing in a value. So let's just use this text value in our text field here. So we just remove the constant that we defined before and we type in text and we use a $sign. So the $sign is what binds our text property to our text field. And now what we want to do is we want to basically update our UI whenever an error occurs. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically check to see if this error is nil, and if it is nil, then we're going to do something, and if it isn't, then we'll do something else. So the first thing we're going to do is if this error is nil, and we're going to basically leave the border to be gray, and if it isn't nil, then we're going to basically turn it red. So let's do that now. Essentially, what we're going to basically say in this text field here is we're basically going to say error dot error description. So we're just going to say error description, and if there is an error description, then this will basically unwrap it and put it in the text field. And if it isn't, then we're going to use this double question marks here to basically fall back to a default value, which will be an empty string. Sorry, I had a I had a brain fart moment there. The amount of times I've wrote this and I completely just forgot what I did. All right, cool. So what we need to do now is we actually need to observe our text and actually perform the validations via our text form component. So in order to actually observe changes to a state variable, there's actually a modifier in SwiftUI called onChange that allows us to listen to changes within our, object. So just to keep this clean, you can actually use this onChange anywhere. So I'm going to use it outside of the scope here so we don't get a cluttered, VStack. So here, I'm just going to say, so what we're basically going to do here is whenever our text state variable changes, because it's bound to our text field, we're basically going to update our error with the validation error if there is one. So I'm going to type this out and then we'll break it down a bit more. So what we're doing here is we're basically using a high order function to basically get the validations from our component. What we're going to do is basically going to loop through with our compat map to basically get all the validations and validate each one with the text that someone's inputted, and then we're basically going to get the first value and use that inside of error. So because this is optional, when we update our error, if the error is nil, then it will basically show the gray opacity, and if it isn't nil, then we can show our red and we can actually show our error description. So this is why we marked it as optional. All right, cool. So now let's go into our content view and actually see this in action. So if I go into email and just start typing, you can see here now it's actually giving me an error. And if I put the @ symbol in, you can see the error goes away. And if I want to test out the other state, so if I do an @ symbol here, you can see it tells me that it's less than 6 characters. So we've now actually got our validation in place. But we've actually got a problem. So the problem that we've got here is that we don't actually update our form content builder whenever someone's actually typing in a value. So it's not aware that someone's actually typed in the email, first name or last name or whatever that is. Essentially, we basically want to have a single source of truth. So a single source of truth essentially means that we just want to have one place where we basically manage the state of our object. So we can actually do that in our form content builder, but we actually need to find a way to actually pass our state object content builder into our components. Now, the easiest way to do this in SwiftUI is using something called an environment variable. So what we're going to do is we're going to create our environment variable in our text field, and we're going to also create a function that allows us to update our content builder whenever someone has finished typing something in. So let's go inside of our form content builder implementation first. And what we're going to do is inside of here, we're actually going to define a function that allows you to basically update the value in your content array. So let's do that now. So we've defined implementation in our protocol. So this function is going to take in any value, and then what we're going to do is we're going to update the form component that someone has inputted that value in for. So now if we just scroll down to the bottom, well, let's implement our function. So at the bottom here, we're just going to say update. All right, cool. So now we have our function. All right, cool. So let's just break this down. So what we're using again here is a higher order function called first index. So what this is going to do is basically going to look for the first component in our array that matches the ID, so the unique UUID, not the form ID, the unique UUID, and basically get us the index. And it's important that you use the ID and not the form ID, because it's possible to have an array of IDs such as DOB. So I could actually do DOB here, and then now these two are not unique. So this is why we created that single property in our form component called ID, so we could uniquely identify each one. So this form field isn't unique, it's only for the actions and events. So we basically get the index, and then what we do is we basically get our array content, pass in the index, then we basically just update the value within our array. So this will update the value. So this is going to act as a function that allows us to update our single source of truth. So what we need to do now is in our text field component form view, so we actually need to actually pass in this content builder into our text form component. So in order to do that, like we said before, we're going to use environment object. So let's go into our text field form view now. And above our state, we're going to create a new property. Cool. As you can see, we basically created a new property called content builder, which is of type environment object, and it's using the form content builder implementation. So when you define an environment object, it's good to get into the habit of doing this. So the first thing you want to do is you actually want to inject your environment variable, your environment object in your previews. So here, let's just do that now. So it's really important that you do this, because if you don't do this, there's a possibility that your previews will crash. So that is one downside of environment objects, is that when you're using it, it doesn't actually provide like any kind of linting to enforce that you have to add it into the previews and in your views. So maybe in WWDC that's coming up, they'll improve that. But it's just something to keep in mind. And now what we need to do is we actually need to use our update function that we wrote before in our onChange. So here, above where we validate if there's an error or not, we're just going to basically say content builder dot update text in component. So now what this is going to do is when you're typing, this is going to update the text within the text form component that we passed in. And then finally, what we need to do is, because we've defined our environment object here, to actually link this child view to its parent, we need to actually inject this content builder into the form view here. So to do that, we're just going to say dot environment object, and then we're just going to basically pass in our content builder like so. So now, because we've done that for our text form component, we need to do the same for our date form view. So we're not going to do it for our button, and I'll discuss that in a bit, what we're going to do for this instead. But for our date form view, let's do the exact same thing. So let's go into it. All right, cool. So as you can see, in our date form view, we actually are not tracking anything to do with the date. So you can see here, we actually have a hard constant for the date, and we're not actually checking any errors. So we're not actually doing any validation in here at all. So what we need to do is we need to basically put all the stuff that we did before with the text field component, and we need to now apply it to the date form view. So let's create two state variables. So for our error and our date. All right, cool. And now that we've got our two state variables, let's bind our selected date to our date picker. So rather than having this constant, we're going to use selected date like so. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use our validation error, so our error, to basically update our label. So let's do that now. So as you can see, this component actually doesn't have a border or anything around it, so we don't actually need to set the stroke for any borders or whatnot. So now what we need to do is similar to our text field form view, we need to basically listen to the changes for whenever the date changes and actually do some sort of validation. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So as you can see, because we've now bound our selected date to our date picker, whenever this value changes, we're now going to perform validation on our component. So via our component, we're going to get all the validations. We're going to validate the date that someone selected, and then we're going to basically get if the first error, if there is one. So if there's an error, like I said before, then we'll show the error in the text, and if there isn't, then we won't. So now the next thing we need to do is we need to actually update the content builder with the date that someone has selected. So again, we'll go use an environment object. So let's do it at the top here. And then because we created our environment variable at the top here, let's just scroll down to the bottom and then let's just inject that in so we don't forget to do that. So now because we've set that up, next thing we need to do is we need to actually update our content builder in our on change. So let's do that now. Right, cool. And then finally, to box this one off, we're going to go back to our content view. And then similarly to what we did before, where we injected our content builder using the environment object, we're going to now do that on our date form view. Okay, cool, sweet. So now we have one more component. So we have a button form view here, but the button doesn't do any validation. The whole point of this button is to simply just output to us what someone has tapped. So that what someone has tapped is essentially the form field that we declared before. So what we're going to do with this button is we're actually going to use a closure so it can basically tell us the form field that someone has tapped. So if you just go into the button form view, let's basically create a type alias for our handler and then handle it inside of here. See what I did there? So what we're going to do is create a type alias. I'm just going to call this button action handler. Right, cool. So let's just break this down. So essentially, we're basically creating a closure here where it's not going to return anything. But when we basically call this handler, we're essentially going to pass through our closure the form ID that someone selected. So the reason why I'm using a type alias here is because I don't really want to have to type this out over and over and over again, and it may not be clear to what its purpose is. So by using a type alias, it's clear to basically anyone who looks at this, like what this is, so what the purpose of this closure is. So now let's define a handler. Cool. So we've got our handler, and it should complain here saying that we're missing a handler. So what we're going to do is we're just going to do this here, like so. So we can fix that. So we just basically just add in a default parameter that just does nothing. Okay, cool. So what we need to do is we now need to actually use our handler, but we need to mark it as escaping because we're using the closure outside of this line here in the scope. So if you just hold down Command on your keyboard and then just basically click on your struct, you'll see an option here called Generate Member-Wise Initializer. So just click on that. And what that's going to do is going to basically generate an initializer for you automatically because I'm way too lazy to type all this out. So as you can see here, we've now got our handler and it's escaping. So what we want to do is we actually want to use our handler in our button action tab to tell us which form item someone selected. So inside of here, we're going to say handler, and then we're going to say component dot form ID. So now it's going to tell us which form ID someone has specifically tapped. So if we just basically go here, now in our content view, we should get an error saying that we're missing our no. So let's add this in at the end here. And now we can actually put in here our ID in. Just make this a bit more. And what we're going to do here is because our form ID is a enum, we're going to basically switch on it. So let's just say switch on the ID. And then if the case is submit, what we're going to do is we're basically going to do some validation. Okay, cool. So what we're basically going to do here is that if the case is submit, we're going to perform some sort of validation on the entire form. And obviously if it isn't submit, then it's not actually going to do anything. So what we need to do now is in our form content builder implementation, essentially we've basically got our content builder here. And like I said before, we want a function that will validate our whole form. But what we also want is we actually want something to tell us that the form is valid or not. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to use enums to basically drive events to actually tell us whether a form is valid or not. So we're going to literally use event-driven enums. So what we're going to do is before we actually create our validate function, we're going to define an enum and use that to basically observe the state of the current form. So if you just go into your form folder here, let's create a new group called event. And then we're going to create a new file. And we're just going to call this form state. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create an enum for form state. And this enum essentially is going to have two cases. It's going to have valid or fail. So the whole point of valid is to basically tell us whether the form is valid, and if it is valid, it's going to give us a struct of all the objects that it's collected. And we're going to have another case called fail, which essentially will basically tell us that it's failed and give us the validation error that it failed with. So let's do that now. So first thing we'll do is just create a struct called user. Cool. So we basically got our struct here, user, and as you can see, it's got all the properties that we want to collect from our form and their types. And now what we're going to do is we're going to create our first case, which is going to be valid. And then let's go have an associated type user. Cool. And now what we need to do is create our new case as well called fail. And this is going to have an associated type error, which will be a type validation error. All right, cool. So because we actually want to use an enum to basically observe the state of when the enum property changes, we actually have to make this enum equatable. So what we're going to do is we're going to write an extension on our enum so we can actually compare to see if the state of it has changed. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So as you can see here, we've got to make a few updates. So when you're working with form states and it's equatable, so essentially because it's an enum and it has associated values, Swift actually isn't able to actually figure out whether the enum is the same or not. So what we have to do is we have to actually write our own implementation to basically tell it what it should consider when two cases are the same or when two cases are different. So if you just look at this example here, we basically say on the valid case, if the left-hand side and the right-hand side is the same, then we could assume that they're equal. And with the error, we're basically saying if the left-hand side and the right-hand side, if the error description is the same, then we can assume that it's equal. If none of these match, then we'll assume that it's false. So with the valid state, you can see here with user, we've had to add a new type here called equatable. And the reason why that is, again, is because Swift isn't able to actually figure out whether our struct is the same or different. So we have to mark it as equatable so it can do that. All right, cool. So now what we're going to do is we're basically going to use our form state in our content builder to essentially observe the changes to it. So to our protocol, let's add a new property underneath this. Okay, cool. And then now in our class, we should get an error, which is what we want, which is fine. All right, cool. And now what we want to do is for our state, we actually want to make this a published property and mark it as private set. So number one, we can observe it with the publish, so we can list the changes. And the reason why we want to mark it private set, similar to what we did with our content, is so this can be accessed from outside of the class, but we can only change the state within the scope of this class, so we can protect it essentially. Because we don't want someone to be able to change the state outside of it, because that might just might just start doing a madness. So now let's do this. So now what we need to do, that we've got this, is we now actually need to create our function to validate it. So underneath the update, let's create a new function, validate, and then we should get complaints down here. So underneath here, let's just type out validate. And then now let's write our code to actually validate and change the state of our form. So we've now got a validate function. Let's break this down. So what we're doing is we're basically getting the content and we're going to filter out any form IDs that are not submit, because we don't want to validate the submit button. So we just want to take it out because there's no point of it being there. And then what we're going to do is we're going to loop through all our form components, so all our components in the array, and then we're going to basically use all the validators to validate the component that we're currently on. And if it finds an error, what it's going to do is it's going to basically change the state to fail and basically change the state so we can omit that error and observe it. And then we're going to stop execution. So this will actually stop it from executing the rest of the code, because we don't want it to carry on going throughout the entire form. Once it finds an error and it fails, we essentially just want it to stop. But if it doesn't find an error when it's looping through all the validations within each component, then what we're going to do is we're going to basically build out our struct by getting the first component where the ID is first name, last name, email, and date of birth. We're going to get the values and cast them. We're going to build our struct, as you can see here. And then finally, we're going to change the state to valid and pass through our new user. So what we need to do now finally is essentially when someone actually wants to validate the form, we actually need to call this function within our content view. So let's do that now. So we just go to the content view, and where we put the comment validate, all we need to do now is call the function on our content builder to validate it. So now that will validate our form. So there is one small thing that we need to do. And the final thing we need to do now essentially is when someone validates the form, we need to actually listen to and observe the changes to the state that we defined a second ago. So on our scroll view at the very end, so at the very end here, what we're going to do is we're going to listen to that state. So after the padding, horizontal padding, if you just do on change of, cool. So let's just observe what we've done here. So if we basically check what we've done here, we're basically check to see if the state has changed. And whenever the state for this changes, if it's valid, we're basically going to just print out the form is valid with the user object that we passed through. If it's failed, then we're going to print out the error that we passed through. And if this state is nil, then it's just basically going to do nothing. That's what that case.none is checking for. So yeah, so optionals are actually enums as well. So that's pretty interesting. So what we're going to do now is we're going to actually run and test this out. All right, cool. So now if I actually tap the confirm button, you can see here it tells me that it's failed with an invalid first name entered because we've not filled out the home form. And if I just type in my first name here, so that's valid. But once I put a space, you can see that the form now becomes invalid. So if I just do the same thing, I'm just going to fill this out normally. On email, I'm just going to fill this out. So you can see as I start typing, it's invalid. If I put in an @ symbol, it's still invalid until I keep on typing. So I'm just going to basically keep typing. And we didn't test out the date one, so let's test that out now. So if I choose a date that's below 18, like 2015, you can see how we have the error message here saying that the user is below the age of 18. And if I choose a date that's over the age of 18, so if I just scroll down here to like 75, you can now see that error has now gone away. So now if I hit confirm on the button here, you can see that it's printed out that the form is valid and all the information is here. And if I update the state of my objects, if I just change my name here to like junior, and if I just put Adigrois, and if I do comms, if I just change the date to 81, now if we just basically print this out, you can see here that the state, so the object has been updated. So we're now managing our single source of truth properly. But if I now completely clear this, and if I now basically hit confirm, you can now see it's telling me the error for where the form is invalid. So you can see how it tracks all the states and it tells us when something is right or wrong. So if you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate if you gave it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate it. Also as well, I want to thank everyone who's helped me reach 1,000 subscribers. I appreciate the support. It means a lot to me. If you have any other suggestions for any other videos, I'd love to basically, hear your feedback and any suggestions in the comment section below. As well, if you haven't already, I'd love if you subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you basically get updates for whenever I release a new video. That's everything from me. Forza Inter, we won the league, we won the Scudetto. So that's everything from me. I'll catch you all in a bit. Deuces.